Thank you for being here tonight. Really quick, let me just introduce our two authors. We've got Nicholas Litursky. I know him as Nick. Do you go by one or the other?
I'm Nicholas on paper.
Okay, Nicholas. He has a JD and a PhD and is an adjunct senior lecturer at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I know just recently got his PhD, right? And so congratulations to him after many years of study. He has published in a number of trade magazines or journals, I guess is what it would be, that I don't believe were Mormon related in that research. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Cheryl Bruno here is an independent researcher, and she's published in a couple of journals that you're familiar with, the Journal of Mormon History, John Whitmer Historical Journal, and a number of other places, and we're so grateful that they are here to speak with us tonight. Really quick, a couple of things. If you need to use the restroom, they are down the hall by the drinking fountain, and if you buy a book, I'll give you the code. But no, it's 254 is the code to get in the bathrooms. We will have some refreshments in the hallway afterward. Feel free to join with us and refresh yourselves a little bit. We have a whole bunch of books already signed, but if you'd like to have a book inscribed by the authors, they will be available after they speak for inscriptions and visiting. Any questions while we're at this juncture? The last thing I'd remind you is please turn off your cell phones and anything else that might make a disturbance during this presentation. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Nicholas Litursky.
Well, thank you all. Does anybody have trouble hearing me? My voice usually carries pretty well. Okay. So, as we mentioned, this book really started 20 years ago, back in 2002. At that time, I was living in Nauvoo, and I realized a long-time interest by becoming a Freemason. I was actually the first Latter-day Saint to become a Freemason in Hancock County, Illinois, since the Saints left in the 1840s. And I had a wonderful experience in my lodge there. But during the years before, I was almost zealous in my LDS membership. And so I had spent so much time with Joseph's lectures and speeches, so much in the history, that when I went through my Masonic initiations, I kept hearing Joseph Ping over and over. Just kept hearing, things that reminded me of things that Joseph had said or done. And, kind of naive at the time, I thought, wow, maybe Freemasonry was a prophecy of Joseph Smith. That was the actual impetus of this book to begin with. Don't look for that in the book. It's not there. It's not true. But that was kind of the germ that got this started. I had the opportunity over the next several years to do a lot of research with primary sources. Since I was in Hancock County in that area, I was able to go back to lodge records of existing lodges in the area, such as Bodley Lodge in Quincy, which dealt with the Mormons, and go to the original sources instead of repeated telephone games, basically, that had gone on in other writings. I also was able to travel other locations. So, knowing certain ways to identify myself, I was able to go places like Arkansas in the lodges where some of the members of the Baker and Fancher train had come from. And, talk to the lodge secretaries there and get them to open closets and go in the back and dig out boxes that have been duct taped shut for years of their records. And, dig out all these primary source materials. After a time, I had about 100 pages of manuscript written, and I had my own changes going on in my life. I came out of the closet. I did resign my membership in the LDS Church in 2006, and I was in the process of rebuilding my life. So I was not making much progress, and it was important to get this material out. So I eventually handed over my research materials to Joe Steve Swick, who is a very experienced Freemason and Latter-day Saint, and every bit as qualified as I was, if not more so, to do this work. Joe worked on it for several years. He and I had a lot of conversations, long discussions of the evidence and different ideas. And then somebody came along who actually made this happen.
I can see that all of you are just salivating when you hear about these boxes, dusty boxes. And I was too. When I learned that Nick had passed along his materials to Joe, I thought, this was 2009, I thought, well, why didn't he give them to me? Now, I'm not a Freemason. There was no reason why he would have given them to me. He didn't know me, and neither did Joe. But I wanted to get my hands on that. I was just beginning my career as a Mormon historian, and I'm very into Mormon esoterica. And so Freemasonry, tarot, any kind of Mormon esoterica really fascinated me, and I wanted to be a part of that. But a few years went by, and I eventually got to know Joe, and I moved to Seattle. And Joe asked me to, he saw my interest, and he asked me to come and help him organize his research materials. So that was awesome for me. I was excited to do that, and so I got to see some of the things that Nick passed along to him. There were files, there were dusty old books, just wonderful things for a historian to get their nose into. So for several years, from 2012 to maybe 2014-15, I studied Freemasonry under the tutelage of Joe. And the interesting thing about his teaching me was that he taught by the Socratic method, which I hate. I would ask him a question, like, for example, does the beehive mean the same in Masonry as it does in Mormonism? And he'd say, well, what do you think? And I'd say, well, I don't know, that's why I asked you. And he'd say, well, have you read this book? No, well, go read this book. And then come back, we'll talk about it. So I'd go read the book. And then I'd come back and I'd say, oh, well, Brigham Young said this, and this person said this person said this, and then he'd say, well, what do you think? And he would pull it out of me. So sometimes I would come up with something that he was leading me to, and sometimes I would come up with something totally different. And then we'd bash it out for a while, which was really fun. So eventually, I'd say like 90% of our conversations were about Mormonism and Freemasonry, but then we got married. So we continued, then maybe 95% of our conversations were about, so we would go to, for example, one day we went to the Pancake House to have brunch. And as was our habit, I would take along my laptop, and he would start pontificating, and I would type busily, and then we would talk about it. And so we went on and on and on, and pretty soon I thought, well, I'm getting really hungry. And we had already had brunch. I looked at my watch, it was 5 o'clock. Wow. So then we ordered dinner, and we stayed until the place closed. And we often did this. We just got carried away with our conversations about Freemasonry. We also had a group. Do you want to tell them a little bit about our Facebook, or our message group that we...
Sure. So in time, Cheryl basically invited me to become more directly involved again in the project. And because I had ongoing conversations with Cheryl and Joe, but hadn't really been active in it. Cheryl raised that possibility, and we ended up with a small Facebook group of primarily Mormon Masons, and began bouncing ideas and getting their responses. And Cheryl was giving drafts of chapters to get their feedback. So we had sort of a test audience for a lot of the material, so we could see whether the arguments were making sense, or whether they were incomplete, or whether we were missing the mark as far as anybody on the outside reading.
So I don't know if these guys will mind if I mention their names, but we had Clinton Bartholomew and Patrick McCleary, Art De Hoyos, anybody else? Nick, and Joe and I.
Yeah.
So At this point, I had still not really organized the materials. I had scanned a few things in, and but I was like, we got to start writing. We have to write. We have to write. And since I'm a writer, I started writing. And then I would make these drafts, send them along. Joe and I would get, talk about them. And about this time, Joe had his first stroke. And he did go to the hospital for a couple of weeks, then had some speech therapy and was able to come back like 90% of his self. But at this time we had divided our chapters into, we had each picked what we were interested in. We had written out what our chapters were going to be, and then we had Joe's chapters and Cheryl's chapters. Well, he wasn't able to write. So I thought, I got to get all this out of his brain, So I would try to have him talk about his ideas, and I think there probably was a lot more in there that never came out and isn't in the book. But our final draft of the book was almost 900 pages, so we had to actually cut a lot of it out that you're not seeing. But you will see later on in articles that we'll both come out with in books. So you'll see the rest of it at some point. But anyways, then after that, we really put an emphasis on writing, getting the chapters done, getting this all put into words and in the book. And
I just really want to point out, this book would not have been finished because I lost momentum, quite honestly. This book would not have been finished, period, if Cheryl had not picked up and really carried the torch and brought this home to fruition. I'm really thankful that I was able to get back involved directly toward the last few years, but she wears the crown here.
So it's really, I like to think of when Joe and I got married, it was a second marriage for both of us, and we were both sealed in the temple to our first husband and wife, and had children with our first spouses, and so we did not ask for that to be changed, but instead we decided to get married differently. We got married on the beach on Whidbey Island in Seattle, and Nick was our officiant. Yes, he was a spiritual practitioner, shamanic practitioner, and so we asked him to perform the ceremony, and we were on this beautiful beach, and we did a hand fasting, where I don't know if many of you have seen this, but Joe and I took each other by the hand in a grip, and we had colorful ribbons, and Nick wove the ribbons in and out of our hands and bound us together. And I think of the three of us, our hands, together on that beach, and I think that that's very symbolic of this book. All of us had a hand in this work, and this book would not be here without each one of us. So that's what I like to think about it. So we have some passages from the book that we'd like to read.
Go ahead.
All right, so if you have your book, my first reading is going to come from Greater Than Solomon. And I'm going to start on page 287. In ancient times, operative masons removed coarse stones from a quarry in the shape of a rectangular solid. These rough ashlars were intended for use in the construction of a building, but before any such stone could be placed in a building, it required smoothing and shaping by tools in the hands of a stonemason. Every lodge room holds both a rough ashlar and a smooth ashlar. The rough ashlar is placed in the northeast corner of the lodge to signify the rough human personality in its natural state. The smooth ashlar is in the southwest corner and represents the refinement of character to which Freemasons aspire. Together, these stones symbolize their journey from natural crudeness to spiritual sophistication and excellence. Initiates are charged to engage continually in self-improvement, to allow life to smooth their rough edges, and to become better men and Freemasons. This allegory was applied by Joseph Smith to himself on May 21st, 1843, when he stated, "I am like a huge rough stone rolling down from a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else. All hell knocking off a corner here and a corner there. Thus I will become a smooth and polished shaft in the quiver of the Almighty, while these smooth polished stones with which I come in contact become marred." Heber C. Kimball, by then a Freemason for about 15 years, repeated this metaphor at a church conference in Boston a few months later. Joseph Smith never professed to be a dressed, smooth, polished stone, but to have kicked himself rough out of the mountain, and he has been rolling among the rocks and trees, yet it has not hurt him at all, but he will be as smooth and polished in the end as any other stone, while many who were so very polished and smooth in the beginning get badly defaced and spoiled while they are rolling about. I dare say many of you in this room have heard these quotes by Joseph Smith, rough stone rolling, right? You've heard that. But you didn't know that the Masonic significance behind this, that it was to a Freemason, they would immediately have a picture in their mind of the rough and smooth ashlars. And so I think a lot of these things in Mormonism that we who are versed in Freemasonry can see immediately, most Mormons don't recognize that. And so we hope this book will help you recognize some of these things that have a basis in Freemasonry and have Masonic background. And I like to use the illustration of my daughter, my oldest daughter, when she went through the LDS temple, came home and said, "Mom, everyone talks about the temple all the time, and I just never realized it." She had heard phrases like "return and report," and we say that all the time in our wards, but that comes from the temple. And once she'd gone through the temple, she was like, "Well, that comes from the temple." Well, what she didn't realize, and what I haven't told her yet, is that actually comes from, that phrase comes from Freemasonry. And now you all know that.
I'm actually going to read two short excerpts. I'm going to begin on page 398, and then I'll shift to page 412. Most of you are probably familiar that Lucinda Morgan, the widow of William Morgan, subsequently married George Harris. They joined the LDS Church. And later on, of course, Lucinda became a plural wife of Joseph Smith. A gentleman by the name of B.W. Richmond decided that he should go to Nauvoo. And he happened to pick the most crucial time to arrive in the midst of crisis. And it was while Joseph and Hiram were in Carthage. The words and actions of some Mormons at the time suggest that they were aware of active Masonic involvement in the murder of the Smiths. Dr. B.W. Richmond, a non-Mormon, arrived in Nauvoo on June 24th, just before Joseph and Hiram left for Carthage. Sometime between then and the murder of the Smiths, he visited with Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, knowing of her history as the widow of William Morgan. He later wrote that she had a copy of An Inquiry into the Nature and Tendency of Speculative Freemasonry by John G. Stearns laying out. Richmond's detailed description of the book, however, specifically noting its fine frontispiece engraving of William Morgan, indicates that he misidentified the book. In all likelihood, Lucinda was displaying the equally popular Light on Masonry, a collection of all the most important documents on the subject of speculative Freemasonry by Elder David Bernard. She had taken it out, Richmond wrote, and thought if the mob did come and she was obliged to flee or jump into the Mississippi, she would take it with her. One might imagine her treasuring this volume in the days before photography, with its rare image of her first husband, the father of her children. Now, as one of Joseph Smith's many wives, Lucinda seems to have drawn a direct parallel between the murder of her first husband and the feared impending murder of her prophetic husband. Moving over to page 412, and this is after the murder of the Smiths. On the hot, sunny morning of Friday, June 28th, 1844, two rough wooden boxes containing the bodies of the deceased brothers were conveyed to Nauvoo. With a protective covering of blankets, branches, and hay, they were escorted by their younger brother Samuel H. Smith, Willard Richards, and a guard of 8 soldiers. After arriving around 3 in the afternoon, the bodies were laid out in coffins built by George Cannon and placed side by side beneath the south window of the Mansion House dining room. This private viewing allowed the family to openly express their most profound grief. Captain Dan Jones later wrote, "My eyes beheld the blood of the 2 godly martyrs mingling in one pool in the middle of the floor. Their elderly mother, godly and sorrowful, on her knees in the midst of the blood between the 2, a hand on each one of her sons who lay in gore, her heart nearly broken by the excruciating agony and the indescribable grief." Mary Fielding Smith and Emma Smith entered the room to view the bodies of their respective husbands, each overwrought by their own painful sorrow. Perhaps most surprisingly, however, was the presence of another woman in what would seem to be a position of honored respect on the occasion. B.W. Richmond recalled, "While the 2 wives were bewailing their loss and prostrate on the floor with their 8 children, I noticed a lady standing at the head of Joseph Smith's body, her face covered and her whole frame convulsed with weeping. She was the widow of William Morgan of Masonic memory, and 20 years before had stood over the body of her husband, found at the mouth of Oak Orchard Creek on Lake Ontario. She was now the wife of a Mr. Harris, whom she married in Batavia, and who was a saint in the Mormon Church and a High Mason." Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, whose first husband was most likely killed by vengeful Freemasons in New York, now mourned the murder of a second husband, albeit a secret one, at the hands of Freemasons in Illinois.
So we'd love to get a lot of your questions and get some conversation going. But before we do that, I think that I'd like to talk a little bit about what makes our book different than other things that have been published. A few people have inquired about that. And one, Nick has mentioned that we don't have, in the books that have gone before, in the published works that we have on Mormonism and Freemasonry, generally it is one or the other. Either a Mason is writing about Masonry and Mormonism, which he knows very little about, or a Mormon is writing about the subject, knowing very little about Masonry. So what makes this book different is that we have authors who have been thoroughly steeped in both. You know, all of us have been to the Mormon Temple, and 2 of us have been quite high up in the Masonic organization, and I have done lots of research on that as well and been taught by a master. So we do have this background. We don't have an axe to grind, either one way or the other. We are not doing this to have people lose faith in the Mormon Church. We're not doing this, the opposite. We're not to bolster the Mormon Church. We just want to show you the beauty and the history as well as we can. The other thing that I see is that many people who write about Freemasonry and Mormonism look straight to the correspondences in the temple with Masonry. They look straight to Nauvoo. They look straight to when Joseph Smith joined the lodge in Nauvoo. And they do not realize that Freemasonry permeated Mormonism from the very beginning, even before Joseph Smith was born. You'll see this in the first couple chapters. Masonry affected his father, Joseph Smith Sr., and was all over the United States and was very, very influential in what was going on. And so I don't think other authors bring this in to the extent that we do. And so when you see the effects of Masonry all along, then you can finally, you cannot look at the temple and Masonry until you know all of these things. One of the questions that I had when Joe and I were discussing things is, the biggest question I always was bringing up was, what was Joseph Smith doing? What was he doing? What was he doing with Danites? What was he doing with the Relief Society? What was he doing in the lodge? And gradually we started coming to an understanding of what Joseph Smith was doing with Freemasonry and in the Book of Abraham, in the Book of Mormon, everywhere. And unless you understand those things, which I hope you will after you read this book, you cannot understand those few correspondences that we see in the Mormon temple. And
just to elaborate a little bit on part of what Cheryl said, having the intimate knowledge of both traditions makes a difference here. Before, a lot of these authors who only knew one tradition well either sort of played a game of telephone where they're quoting other authors earlier, or if they did go to the original sources, they didn't understand what they were reading. So one story that has permeated Mormon writing, apologist and what has not been really intended as apologetic writing, is that the Mormons in Nauvoo wanted to create a lodge, so they wrote to Bodley Lodge in Quincy for a recommendation, and those terrible non-Mormons in Quincy refused to give them a recommendation because they hated Mormons, and it was religious prejudice. It's not the case at all. You go into the actual record of Bodley Lodge, and you find out that it was because nobody in Bodley Lodge had ever sat in lodge with any of the Nauvoo Mormons. And this is a fundamental requirement of issuing that recommendation. You have to have actually sat in lodge with the people who are proposing to create the new lodge, so you know them as Masons. Therefore, they were in a position they could not issue the recommendation. So there's a lot of little things like this where we needed the knowledge of both traditions in order to get at the actual story, instead of a lot of confusions.
yeah. And what you might expect if you're a lodge that is getting a request to be recommended, you might expect that then, when they made their refusal, you would expect that the lodge would come and then say, oh, well, let's get to know you, and let's sit in lodge together. But instead, they went over their head, and that started an animosity, which we later see.
They all, and frankly, the Nauvoo Lodge went on to do some strange things in relation to Bodley Lodge. They, for example, invited the members of Bodley Lodge to come to Nauvoo to celebrate the Feast of St. John's Day, which is a Masonic observation. But instead of the invitation coming from the lodge, it came from the first presidency of the church, which was completely inappropriate in a Masonic setting. Not only that, but if you look at the description of this event in the minutes of Bodley Lodge, it says, and that there were certain ciphers attached. Well, those of you who are holding a copy of the book, look on the edge, very edge of the dust jacket, on both front and back, and you'll see some white figures. And we're not going to tell you what it says, but we'll give you the hint. It's Royal Arch cipher, and you can figure it out. Royal Arch cipher had no place in the regular Blue Lodge of Freemasonry. So what you sort of had was Nauvoo Masons saying, hey, look at us, look, we know this, we're really cool, by slipping in this additional message, and it was not received well.
We already have one person who has figured it out, so we would love for you, if you figure it out, let us know.
Yes.
Let us know if you figure out what that cipher says.
And we're not we're not telling anybody not to be mean about it, but where's the fun in that? So.
We want you to have the fun. At this time, we'd love to take some questions from you and get a conversation going.
So the beautiful cover. Now I've read Michael Quinn's book a couple of times on magic, and what's the relationship between Freemasonry and esoteric Mormonism, or vice versa? But are these Masonic, or are they magic, or are they both?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the Jupiter Talisman. The cover design was prepared by Joseph Johnston, who now lives in Fort Madison, Iowa. Joseph was the second Latter-day Saint to become a Mason in Hancock County, and I had the honor of bringing him into the lodge. And he's a dear friend, and he designed this cover for us. When the Jupiter Talisman was collected by Wilford Wood from Charles Bittaman, son of Louis Bittaman, he relayed that Emma called it Joseph's Masonic piece, and it was something very dear to him. It is, in fact, a Jupiter Talisman from a book called the Magus, and we know that it is from the Magus because there is actually an error in the Jupiter Talisman that Joseph had that is attributable to a printing error in the Magus. They actually got the design slightly wrong, and so it's definitely from that source. The interplay of Freemasonry and ceremonial magic has a long history. And so when you ask that either or sort of question, well, it's yes.
Okay.
And both definitely had an influence, and there just might be an author working toward another book specifically addressing Joseph as a magician.
Very nice. All right. And I hope it's not 15 years from now.
We've gotten a little better.
Gotten a little better, and I'm a little older. You know, I'm not counting on 20 years. You have a hand. Oh, yes, Gary.
Could you talk a little bit about John Bennett's involvement in the lodge and also some of the details of his departure from the lodge?
Yes, John Bennett was very involved in the lodge. He was the one who wrote to Bodley Lodge asking them for a recommendation to the Grand Lodge. So we wonder, and we don't know this for sure, but we wonder if he was at first slated to be the first worshipful master of the Nauvoo Lodge.
Secretary. Yeah.
But he's not. But he became the secretary of the lodge, and he was very good. He was at every meeting. Not a lot of Masons were at every meeting. He was at every meeting while he was, those first few months while he was the secretary. And he took very good notes and was very dedicated to the lodge. And then ran into some difficulty with Joseph Smith. I'm sure you all are well aware of his difficulty with polygamy and his breakup with Joseph Smith, and left the church. When he left the church, he wrote several hit pieces on the church. Was very hurt, I think, by the way he was treated, and understandably so. I'm sort of sympathetic to him in the chapter where we talk about Bennett. And he wrote many things about Freemasonry. And a lot of people say, well, John C. Bennett was not a reliable source because he went over the top when he talked about Freemasonry. And we write in our chapter that he actually did not go way over the top. Many of the things he said about the Nauvoo Lodge, we can now point to and prove that these were true, you know? And so he actually was much more of a reliable source than anyone really gives him credit for, in my opinion.
And that's actually, you know, the one criticism we've received so far in any published review is that we cited, for example, John C. Bennett. But yeah, the fact is, that where he spoke concerning the lodge, he was accurate. We were able to back it up. Here and then here and okay.
Okay, just a question with your extensive research and backgrounds and everything. Where do you personally see the origination of the Masonic rituals coming from? I mean, was it Rosicrucian? Was it Templars? Was it early Catholicism? The ancient Christian church? The threads of that seem to weave its way all the way back. Can you comment on that?
The idea that Freemasonry actually exists from the time of Adam is a metaphor or a legend which shows up in Masonic ritual. And it was taken as history by many of the early Latter-day Saints. In reality, you know, we have records back to the 1700s Before that, this really comes out of medieval trade guilds, and the fact that they did have to have ways of showing their bona fides. As Masons traveled from place to place to find work, they were given ways to identify their level of recognized skill. As these trade unions began to decrease in membership, they began to allow what they called speculative Masons. And these were people who began to recognize philosophical and mystical and spiritual meaning in the symbolism. So I hope that answers your question.
You kind of dodged me just a bit.
Okay.
Let me go on a little bit.
Please go for it.
So I feel like that when a lot of people look at Freemasonry and they want to see like the antecedents, what came first, Masons were really interested in antiquity. They loved antiquity, and so they loved to draw those threads and bring them in. So we do see a lot of that. It's like people who do genealogy, and they like to go back to the royal genealogy, and then they go back even further into legend, and then you have, way back to Adam, but you have to go through different legends. And so this is like what Freemasonry does, is we go back and back and back, and then we have this legend that comes in, and a lot of times we see many ancient things. A lot of people like to look at ancient parallels that Joseph couldn't have known, but he actually could have known those things because Masons were talking about those things and searching for those things and bringing them in to the lodge. And so you really do have, a kind of a mixture, a soup of truth and legend, and we can't really separate those.
Good. That's a good response too, as well.
One more here, and then back.
Yeah, so, when you first kind of hear about Mormonism, Masonry relation, one of the biggest stories you hear is how Joseph very quickly ascended to level of Master Mason within a matter of hours or days. And the implication of that is that it had already been downloaded into him, right, previously, and that, right, this just, that he already had it, and then this just was a recognition, right? What's the real story behind that?
So after Bodley Lodge refused to grant a recommendation, Abraham Jonas, who was the Grand Master of Illinois, and also the former in-law of Joshua Seixas, who taught the Mormons Hebrew in Kirtland, had political ambitions. And the Mormons, frankly, were a large voting bloc. And so he was influenced, and also his deputy was James Adams, who of course was associated with the Saints. So that confluence of factors led Abraham Jonas to issue the recommendation. Abraham Jonas was the sitting master of Columbus Lodge, which is almost exactly the same distance from Nauvoo as Bodley. So it was legitimate to allow the recommendation from Columbus Lodge. The idea of Joseph and Sidney being, made Master Masons on site is something that gets a lot of debate, but the reality is it was the prerogative of the Grand Master, and all it really means is that they were advanced through the degrees without the customary waiting period during which you study a catechism of questions and answers.
Okay.
So it's a number of factors that led him to do that, but it's not that Joseph knew it all before at that stage in detail. Although the book certainly is going to show you how he learned Masonry from the cradle, but it is recognition of his station, of him as a VIP, if you will.
So, but it's like going to Eagle Scout. I got all the merit badges. I want Eagle Scout now, right? I don't wait. But yeah, the implication, right? The way it's portrayed though is, right? He's had all these revelatory experiences. It's been, and maybe growing up, whatever. But it was there, and he could just pass the test, right?
Yeah.
without?
Well, we do know that Joseph Smith had a very his facility with ritual was really amazing. We do know this, and he was quite good at just jumping in and learning it. And so he did have a facility with these kind of things. We call him a ritual genius. So, I mean, I think this was recognized even very early. I think it was recognized that he had some important things to say about the lodge even before he was a Freemason himself.
Okay, Christina, you had your hand up for a while, and then
Yeah. So I just had a question about, I really appreciated how you included like lesser known voices in both Mormonism and Masonry, talking about like the Relief Society being part of this whole structure. And I was wondering, in my recent reading, I don't know anything about Freemasonry, but I recently learned that Freemasonry was segregated. And I'm curious if you can speak to if Joseph Smith, if anything about early Mormon race dynamics was influenced by Masonry at all.
So race dynamics or gender dynamics?
I mean, both. I mean, I would be really interested in both, but I'm really curious about if Joseph Smith's ideas about race were influenced by Masonry, anything like that. Also women.
One thing I really like about Mike Homer's book, which I don't agree with, but I like it, is he has a chapter dealing with race and how Joseph Smith's ideas around race and the Book of Abraham are Masonic. And so you might want to check that out, because that's a very interesting theory, which I kind of don't agree with. But I feel that Joseph Smith was very expansive in his views towards race and women, especially for the time that he lived in. And I think that he took what Masonry offered to women, and he just even went a step further to that. Do you want to expound on that?
yeah, only to say, you know, this part of this idea grows out of a conversation I was entering into back in like 2005, when I realized, okay, you know, you got Brigham Young establishing the priesthood ban at a time when African Americans were not allowed to join Masonic lodges. They created Prince Hall Masonry, which was specifically for the African American community. And I drew a line there and said, wait a minute, maybe this is why Brigham was not allowing them to have priesthood and temple ordinances. I discussed that back in 2005 with Newell Bringhurst, who was doing a lot of work on the priesthood ban at the time, and Newell just completely did not buy it. He completely rejected the idea. I do see that idea was resurrected by Homer, but you know, it's very much up for debate. It's speculative. I personally still kind of lean that way, but it's not one of those things that we can definitely lay that way for sure. There are many things in the book where we had to put together the circumstantial evidence. We had to bring different threads together. And we've tried to be very careful in identifying those things. But at the same time, we were careful not to jump where we did not have a good solid argument. And that was one of those things that was simply not there. Claire?
You mentioned Joseph Smith, you know, from the cradle had Masonry being thrown at him, or he was absorbing that. Would you see it that maybe there were several waves of influence, like, you know, maybe the 1826 anti-Masonic stuff going on, and maybe his becoming a Mason in Nauvoo, and that there were different points where his mind lit up and like, holy smokes, I've got some new Masonic stuff to go after. I don't know. Or is it just all from the beginning? What would you say?
So certainly there were waves, but I'd go on the side of it's from the beginning, and I want to jump on your anti-Masonic because of course I will. We have several people who discuss Joseph Smith and talk of him as being starting out anti-Masonic and then later on, you know, going into being a Mason. and talk about this change in him. And we talk about in the book of Joseph Smith's ideas on this particular subject as being throughout his life very
Consistent.
yes. Thank you. Because, and we go into this also, he had the idea that comes from many important Masonic writers that there is a spurious Masonry and a true Masonry. So we have true Masonry which has degenerated or apostatized from the true thing. And what Joseph Smith was about was to restore true Masonry. And so when he speaks in the Book of Mormon as of the secret combinations, he is talking about spurious Masonry. He's not knocking Masonry. You know, he still has this idea in the Book of Mormon of true Masonry, but also of the degenerate, spurious Masonry that he is asking people to beware of. So he's very consistent on this idea.
And when we say from the beginning, even before Joseph was born, Joseph Smith Sr. was somewhat obsessed with Masonic legend. Of course, when the family lived in Randolph, Vermont, Federal Lodge 15 was there, and they had a local newspaper. Serrano White was the editor, and Serrano White was publishing marvelous poems and articles about the Masonic legends, particularly about the idea of the lost word. And so this is the environment, this is the conversation going on in this small town, in this area. Joseph Smith Sr., about that same time, begins with his treasure digging. You have to understand that in Masonic legend, the lost word was written on a gold artifact. And at this time, people are digging into native artifacts and finding valuable artifacts, digging into native burial mounds and finding valuable and precious metal artifacts. So when Joseph Sr. later on says, "Oh, I've been digging treasure for 30 years," yes, he's been searching. This shows up in his dreams, where he's saying, "You lack just one thing. Oh, I'm going to go grab my paper to write this down," and then he wakes up. You have him taking this very seriously. And when he tried to join the lodge there in Randolph, he was blackballed. It takes one vote, and it's an anonymous vote, to be denied entrance into the lodge. There's a few possible reasons for him to have been blackballed, alcohol being one of them. But one of the reasons that very well may be is that lodge had a number of very sophisticated individuals in it. One of them, for example, went on to be a Supreme Court justice. And so you had a group of people who were getting away from this idea of the legend being true history, were beginning to find that embarrassing. And Joseph Smith Sr. is gung-ho and out there searching for artifacts. At the same time, Dartmouth, which of course is the parent, if you will, of Moore Charity School where Hiram attended, their seal actually shows a line of Native Americans led by one holding a book. These ideas are permeated in the culture. So Joseph is brought up right from the start. And this is why we say, Freemasonry influenced Joseph from the cradle to the grave. And the book shows that entire sequence. Yes?
How much did Joseph Smith know about Royal Arch Masonry?
Good question.
That's the big question.
Yes, good question, because we see a fascination in Joseph for many concepts that come directly from Royal Arch Masonry. And we can't quite connect that he had a direct connection to, he was not a Royal Arch Mason. However, there were many people in Masonry, or in Mormonism, who did have that Royal Arch connection. Newell K. Whitney was one of them, and another one was James Adams. And so he could have very easily, been discussing this with them. But also, the Royal Arch degree had been revealed You know, it was out there in written form.
Sure.
You know, so it wasn't like people didn't know the legend behind it, and he was very, very. And we talk about Royal Arch Masonry several times throughout the book, and what the legend was, and how he taps into it. And when you see that, you kind of know that he was familiar with it, because it's just too close to not see that connection.
You know, I just referred to things where we can't completely
Yeah.
tie the evidence. Springfield chapter of Royal Arch Masons is where James Adams was a member. And it's very interesting because they would hold their meetings on the full moon, which was a common tradition for lodges at the time because it made travel at night easier. And Joseph made trips to Springfield that may have lined up with meetings of Springfield chapter. Unfortunately, the records of Springfield chapter for that time period have long been lost. There was a major fire and they're gone. So there's no way to prove, but it is possible that Joseph received those degrees.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a question. Where does the Eastern Star come in? As Joseph, was he familiar with that? Because the Relief Society was established along with the Council of 50, and the decision on the succession in the presidency, and whether to go to Texas or whether to come out here, and his running for president. This is all related there. Now, you know, a lot of stuff thinking, is there no hope for the widow's son? That's Deep Durham. He talks about, was it Clank or something like that?
Clank.
Clang.
Joseph is always grabbing on something. Now, you mentioned Dartmouth College. You've got a relative of Joseph Smith that did the lectures at Dartmouth and was taught Hebrew at Dartmouth. And a lot of the lectures at Dartmouth, those of you who have collected them, they do talk about the pre-existence and all these LDS doctrines. Now, also, just as an aside, because you've got a lot of interesting things here, you got Jack Welch discovering chiasm in the Book of Mormon. You've got, I have a copy of original of the Improvement Era for 1890 something or other, and that's where two missionaries discovered the existence of the Apocalypse of Abraham. And they go ahead and they translate it from the Slovakian into the English for the first time, which Joseph wouldn't have had access to, and then they do comparisons of the Book of Abraham to the Book of Abraham that Joseph wrote. And of course, now we've got another conundrum of a sort. So there's a lot of conundrums out here, and there, you know, I've worked to try to explain some of this, and I guess I get a little bit to Clank, because he seems to take things, but yet he seems to put together ultimately a story that is very persuasive. And then you have to make that statement, that move to faith. But with all of these issues, you know, well, I have one last thing which I'll say. In my investigations over years, I'm 83 now, I have found that in the war for people's minds, which was the pre-existence, this is not a play that this silly guy does over and over and over again, and he can't seem to learn that he's not going to win. I'm talking about Satan. This is a real battle, and the battle is for battle politics and battle and intelligence. And in this battle, you got to expect that there's going to be things at every step of the battle that will be either true or counterfeit. Now, the real issue is how do you decide which species is counterfeit and which is real? But that is the challenge I find, and as I go along in my life, I keep looking for counterfeits and responses to truth. And at some point, you end up having to make that choice. That's the choice that's left.
Well, you know, I think Cheryl can address most of that, but I just want to say, laying aside the theological question posed, your first question there was Joseph familiar with the Eastern Star? Eastern Star was created in approximately 1856 by Rob Morris in a misogynistic mood because he specifically wrote that this was created as an entertainment for the ladies. He did not create a serious Masonic order, even though there were such things for women in other parts of the world. So, yeah, Eastern Star is after Joseph's life, and with all due respect, I have known wonderful people who participate in Eastern Star, but it's not serious Masonry.
And as to women's involvement, I'd love for you to read that in the book because we have a lot of really interesting things about that. But you addressed many, many different issues as you were speaking, and I think what we say in the book is that we recognize that Joseph Smith drew from a lot of different sources to create Mormonism. He used bricks from many piles, and so we don't say everything he did was Masonic. But we want you to see the influence of Masonry. But we also believe that there were many other things that came into play that are beyond the pale of our
This
book.
is another aside. Dan Brown, in one of his books, makes the statement that the beauty, well, he talks about somebody giving the Masonic call over in China or in India somewhere, and they respond. They're supposed to respond to their fellow Mason. He talks about in the book, one of the books, he talks about the beauty of symbolism, and that symbolism is a way that you can convey across all languages a common message using the symbolism, and that's why you see symbolism so important, particularly in something that was evidently quite extant. Or not extended, but expanded, because if you get somebody in India or wherever it was, and the guy gives them the signal and the high sign, and then they recognize and offer assistance, which obviously, again, would you like to comment lastly, and I'll shut up, about Joseph as he's falling out the window? What did he say, and is that a Masonic petition for assistance?
Yes, we believe that it was, but we also discussed the different ideas. Maybe, some people have different opinions on that, so we discussed those and give our reasons why we felt that it was Masonic. But the most important thing is we see that the people who told the story of his martyrdom believed it was Masonic. They all said this was a Masonic call. And so the people who knew Joseph, the people who didn't know Joseph, they all saw that as Masonic, which is very telling.
Yeah. John Taylor wrote an excoriating editorial, about the shame on you, brethren of the mystic tie, because of the fact that there were Masons standing outside Carthage who did not respond to that call. And as you get into the book, you'll understand more of why they did not.
Thank you.
Can you speak a little bit to the difference between French Masonry and English Masonry with John C. Bennett, and a possible statement by Hosea Stout where he says Brigham Young wrote a letter to the Grand Lodge of England asking that Mormonism be incorporated as a branch of Masonry, something to that nature. I don't know how true these things are. I'm just kind of...
So, from what I understand, several of the Masons in Nauvoo, when they moved to Utah, went to Brigham Young and asked, when are we going to start the lodge up again? And they had several options what they could have done. They could have gone to the Grand Lodge of England. They could have gone to other Grand Lodges and gotten their recommendation. But at that time, Brigham Young decided that that was not the way that they would go. And that's when we see the start of the separation between Mormonism and Masonry.
What do you guys think of Clinton Bartholomew's theory that Joseph was trying to create like a Mormon rite that would sit like on top of Masonry, similar to something like Scottish Rite or where the endowment would be the Mormon rite, or the ritual of the
On
Mormon
top of it,
rite.
yeah.
Well, Joseph was clearly intending to create a Mormon Grand Lodge. The multiplication of Mormon lodges was intentional toward that purpose, and that is specifically discussed in the Nauvoo Lodge record. As far as Joseph creating a Mormon rite, if you will, understand that this was a time when this sort of creativity was common and even encouraged. The new presentation of these ideas and working with ritual was something that was going on in Freemasonry. Jonathan Nye, who had been Grand Master of Vermont back when the family was in Vermont, came out to Illinois because he became basically an itinerant Masonic teacher. And he sort of had this habit of going out and learning one of these new rites that had been established, and then becoming the expert in it and becoming the Grand Master of it, and then going around and teaching it. And it's really interesting because an encounter takes place. You've all read the part that was canonized with Joseph talking about how to recognize a heavenly messenger by certain efforts with the hand. This was a discussion in his office. Parley P. Pratt was present. If you look at the original document, there's a caret in a little addition that Jonathan Nye was present. And it just so happens that this is the point where Jonathan Nye and Joseph have a falling out. So looking at Jonathan Nye's habit and track record, he probably was very aware that Joseph was doing something creative and new with ritual, and said, great, teach it to me, show it to me. And Joseph said, well, it's not for you. And that did not go well. And of course, when Nye suddenly shows up dead, and I have personally tromped every cemetery in the area and gone through newspaper records and sextant records, you cannot find Jonathan Nye's burial. But he was, traveling across the river to give a speech in Fort Madison and suddenly died of cholera. And that's the last we know of Jonathan Nye. When Joseph was informed of the death, very uncharacteristically, basically said, good, this is what you get when you stand against the buckler of Jehovah's belt. Which, of course, was one of the codes for Danites. Those two crossed swords, and it didn't turn out well. But the idea that Joseph was creating a separate Mormon rite, if you will, I would not say in the same sense as the Scottish rite, but certainly drew this line. All of the early individuals that Joseph first revealed the endowment to were Master Masons. And some of them, out of the first 9, some of them were taken through the degrees just before that. So he clearly saw some progression there.
Non-traditional Masonry.
So also, while I differ with Clinton just a little bit, I also see him working with ritual in several different areas. I see him creating a Danite ritual. I see him creating ritual with the Kirtland Egyptian papers, and you'll find that very interesting in the book when you read about that. So I do see Joseph Smith very much as creating rituals in these various aspects.
Yeah, it's just interesting because I think he suggested something along the lines of that Masonry could have been used as temple prep, So I don't know what you think of
That's actually a pretty common idea among people who studied the topic in recent years because of that timing, the way that planned. And of course, the introduction of the endowment did not put an end to Freemasonry. They continued raising Masons in Nauvoo basically right up until the time they were leaving.
The exact day that they stopped doing endowments in the Nauvoo Temple, they stopped doing Freemasonry. But I think that's very telling. What Nick said is that when we think of, lots of people want to say that Masonry was just a preparation and then they got their endowment. Well, we've found instances where they got their endowment first and then became Masons. So that kind of shoots that idea down a little bit, that Masonry was intended, whatever Joseph intended with Masonry, it was intended to go with the endowment. It wasn't just, I mean, it might have been a stepping stone. It was said to have been a stepping stone, but it was also intended to be part of the complete whole.
I mean, understand, long before Joseph was doing any of this, you had Masonic writers saying that a time would come when pure Christianity and pure Masonry would both be restored, and they would be hand in hand. So that's the conversation going on in Joseph's younger years.
And we absolutely see that in Joseph Smith's actions and writings.
Can you speak a little bit to the idea that Joseph Smith had John C. Bennett set up an order of the Illuminati in the Nauvoo Lodge?
So what that was, John C. Bennett, after Joseph Smith's death, had this idea of the Order of the Illuminati, which he first pitched to Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon didn't want anything to do with it. And then he went to James Strang. And we have a little bit about that in the book. In one of the final chapters is how he created this Order of Illuminati in the Strangite branch of the church. I think that's what you're thinking of.
Oh, that sounds close.
Yeah. As far as, during Joseph's life, one of the things that John C. Bennett got, perhaps a little creative about was he referred to as the Cyprian Saints. This idea that the women who were plural wives were being initiated into some form of Masonry. And it's a really interesting observation. I think there's a little yellow journalism going on there, for sure. But at the same time, we have Oliver Olney, who was not a Mason, who was became somewhat of a Mormon outsider in Nauvoo, and he starts writing down, his observations, and as a non-Mason starts describing things that correspond with higher orders of Freemasonry and with women's orders of Freemasonry.
So
And with what Bennett is saying.
Yeah.
Would this have anything to do with Bennett being a French Freemason, where women are allowed in the lodge, or I don't know?
Well, I don't know that
Yeah.
I know of any evidence of him being a French Freemason. I don't know what you mean by
either.
that,
I
yeah.
I've just read pieces of that in that way.
Yeah.
Just kind of curious for us.
Take a couple more and we're
Okay.
at 7:15 here.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Time flies.
Okay.
Anybody else want to ask a question before we're done here?
Thank you so much for
Yes.
coming. It was great to see all your faces.